Send in a highway provision lines of cycles and screen adaptation system. Now, line position locations, the team line recognizes these cycles. They're just getting conversion lines of timer lines. Okay, the realms that correlations and interactions has a direct line of view how you process that position location of 0, 1. Now, I've already set up the mapping settings and location to its ground center, location to its cycles. It's going to be a fast track location live lines. Okay, just trying to understand how to get information system, how we come in that line centers and travel net communications. Sending lines of home, process lines and screen adaptations. Underground line sequence over cross location screens into habitation lines of 6 over flux. You guys have a fortitude in screen adaptation underground lines of sequence. The process communicates the system 1,000 hours in travel. 1,000 hours in travel. Okay, that puts line course centers in line direct locations into 1 light year in travel communications, directing 4 lines of flux, 4 lines of box, 3 lines of measure, 3 lines of scale, process into position of hotel golf, Papa uniform. All right. Directing ground centers calculated and modified, direct signal location setting into the underground service location system all through tractions. Okay. Televise rotation lines and setting travel communications. Underground sequence and simulation grounds. It's not travel communications. All right, so all I'm going to do now is just add the equations in pixelation lines and ground communication setting highlights a sequence in location system to its holographic gridding. Process the line connection system, the simulation ground communication system, all through travel. All through directions, all locations. Working with online centers into the Therians, course centers, calculation lines, and Anterians, location setting to Growthians, information lines, and 3 pyramids and activation screen locations, inside ground lines, into its process calculation grounds. Okay, setting lines of sequence, setting lines of panel, process that positions comes in tractions, all through directions, all through locations. All through structure, all through design. All right, so the equaline course centers and equilibrium course lines of channel, process line position location of tether, process communication system all through travel. Directing ground centers and location setting up its all platforms in the simulation system of its primer. So its operation line sequence and structured design lines in platforms and set track locations. Sets calculation lines of floor mats and screen lines adaptation of wall sequence location and setting and travel. Sets calculation of ground centers of location system through ground communication system and traction. Okay, and then we come into provision settings, processing and calculation, directing grounds and black holes, course centers lines, course center calculation setting, and conversion system to all levels of the galactic empire, right here in tractions. Okay, the empire itself and center line communication. Right, there's the empire. Process in the center line is a course center's line of travel, has a direct line and a link, and a 45 switch lines communicates the system all through circuits. Directing ground centers highlights a sequence, processes communicates the system all through setting. Operation grounds and calculate modify in line screen adaptations of flux. Look at how powerful that is. Okay. Pretty amazing, I'll tell you, all through simulation, guys. All through simulation. All through grounds, all through gridding, all through rotation, service, and travel. Okay. Okay, so now we're just going to get the code signals. Ground centers, calculation lines, and high center communication setting, hotel golf, directing ground centers and lines of sequence, platform over setting, over sequence of the panels. Process the indication system, all through travel, all through setting, all through operation sequence. Start with that set calculations. A centers lines of B over lines of C. C questions over lines of mark. Flux over line centers. Rotation center operation lines 0 correlation setting attractions. That has a direct line link. That we process line over line cross lines indicates in system, all through flux over line. Now that indicates the course centers lines of travel, direct lines of link, process, position, location, setting, and travel. Set lines of question is side lines, 3 centers, 3 travels, over line, cross line to 3 communications. Set lines enter the dome, process line signatures, process lines console, communicates and setting traction locations. Directing ground centers. Now we work at line screen adaptation with settings all through travel. Okay, so we go through panel operation line setting and screen locations. Timeline sequence and 150,000 line send location and ground settings. Process this under lines, under rotation, and travel communications. Platforms here, 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 and here. Okay? And then we equal line course centers, platform in, set lines of communication. Right? Setting sequence and down screens. Process line course centers and platforms over 1. Set lines course centers of 4 set calculations. Platforms over 2. Set coordinates of 3 line communication setting to travel. Platforms of 3 and set lines of ground line communication lines of earth line communication lines of travel. Directing course centers. Process in position location of systems of the calculations. Okay? Indicate location, indicate location, indicate location of 3 centers of travel. All right? Inside lines, simulation grounds, course centers, and string theory. Process indication of planetary lines, 3 centers, 4 set calculations setting to Jupiter, Saturn, and Mercury. Overcross molecular structures of 3 line centers and signal. In that indication system of the track locations in molecular structure of design line. Process the indications of flux over setting over travel. So we set up the platform line centers, line screen dictates to a system, all through set position lines of calculation setting. Coming into wall sequence location of structure. So we have 4 panels, operation line settings into formula equations and set lines of sequence of 3 scales, process lines of indication setting to calculations. So indicate lines of 4 lines of 1 lines, 8 lines of track, 4 8 lines of setting, 3 lines of question, and 3 in centers, 3 communication setting, 3 on standby, 4 on sequence, 7 over line sequence, ground centers of 1, 0 correlation lines of 2, process lines of 3 interactions. That's done through equation. Okay? Directing lengths of panel, process communication system override line centers. That calculates modifies all communication system, all through setting, all through operation lines of sequence locations. Okay, directions. Now, directing length lines of panel, process indicates the system of the grounds and triangulation here. Operation line grounds and position location operation lines of signals in that communication setting of platforms. Equal line centers and travel communications and processing. Platforms over 1, 3, set lines of communication and pyramid activation line rotations. Process indication lines of 45 line angles and travels in that communication nodes high within its set position. Process lines of crossing angles and 4 line communication lines of 3 centers of travel. Directing ground centers on-line sequence location setting to its solar grids. Process of platforms of 45 split lines but only 4 centers of travel in that communication setting of surface. Says calculation ground centers, operation line sequence location system and calculations. Directing ground centers, flux over 1, platforms over 2, 3, and 4 lines of measure and scale and process calculation. Simulation grounds, process lines indicates the system all through travel, all through flux. Okay? Platforms over E, factors over screen over C. Sets travels in point lines of graph, indicates system all through calculations. Okay, inside lines into highways at track location. Okay? All right, so that sets up the platforms. Now we set line course centers. We do the same thing over here, triangulation. We do the equal lines and triangulation line conditions setting to travel. Set position lines, equal lines, split lines of anomaly, clocking lines of 0 and 3 zeros in travel and positions. That calculates in ground centers, line sequence locations, and clock line conditions and compass, process lines of indication, cross line angles, and 4 lines of sequence locations. Set lines of communication lines of travel. Also, we center lines, center screen location setting, 3 lines of flux, process indication lines of 1, 2, platforms of 6 over 12, and set track communications, done by equation. All right, so we center off the set lines in that line signal location setting to travel. Directing ground centers in position location to its system, all through setting through its galactic empire and travel communication. The empire. All right. Now we have line signals. We set location setting to 1 settings, process of 2, process of 3, process of 4, process of 6, and 1 lines of setting. 7 rotations. Change the ground centers of server location system inside illumination graphs and set tractions. Directing ground centers highlights the sequence overcrosses the screen location of clocking through visible chart waves that override the signals into translucent patterns and rotates the surface and travel. Okay, inside the grounds, sets lines of sequence in your pyramid of travel communication. Okay, walking sequence of panels, process of indication setting, road graph screens and locations. Pathogens, sets course centers lines of travel, direct lines of link. Process here, process here, process here, process here, inside the vessel of communication. All right, outside line signals and location setting of travel. Okay, so we platform here and we platform here. We platform here and we platform here. Going in position lines of calculation setting. All right. Process indicates an inside rotation surface attractions. Directing lock lines, space lines, spin line, set lines, course centers, communication setting attractions. Location grids, online centers, line sequence, location system of their travel. Directing ground centered sequence and a 45 line angles of flux over set tractions and locations. Boxing frames, inline rotation, and travel communications. Okay, high line signals. Setting laser lines, laser line rotation line signal, location setting, graphic communication here, out here, inside line condition setting, 4 lines of flux. Arrows of indication cross line angles. Structured visual location system author setting. Set sequence here, 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 outside line communication setting, travel. Sets line communication system, author configures and system author attractions, right? All right. So as we set that up, we set up position, location, and travel and reckon the time frame. That process indicates the system to your pyramids and set line calculations. Inside the rotation surface and travel. Sets calculation and ground centers high line sequence. 0 rotation, 0 calculation, 0 grounds, and 0 surface and rotation surface interaction. Directing ground centers of service and platforms over lines and E factors over screen location setting and triangulation. Process indication lines and grounds over lines and flux over set travel communications. Inside line condition system, all through setting, all through operation. Okay, done by equation. All right. So we center off and we go back into the set lines of travel. And that line course centers of center communication system above the signal and location setting to its galactic empire. 3 signal lines of grounds, 3 centers of channels, operation line sequence into high centers of set position and set travel communications. All right. So that's core centers of channels and operation flux over screen location. Indicates the ground centers, operation line sequence, panels line screen of mapping centers in a 45 angle and flux. Sets travels to point lines graph. Sets the simulation of rotation and set calculations. 4 lines, 5 lines of sequence. Okay? Then we come into the road graph screens, set of communication holographic gridding and set travel. Okay? Then we online this sequence in 3 centers. 6 over line, 8 lines of measure over pi and track communications. Okay? Directing lines of link, process lines of over, cross centers of 3 centers of 4 centers of travels and 5 lines of sequence. Process indication cross line angles and 4 line communication system all through calculation setting. Process indication settings all through set travels and the communication to its yards, meters, its metrics, and its balance of communication setting of flux over line signals and location system of its building structure of design line communication. Done by equation. Online centers, online sequence, and panels of communications. Okay? Very powerful stuff, how to set these things up in position. All right? All through tractions, all through locations. Wild, eh? All right, so we set 4 temperature readings out center. That allocates time frame. Now change the ground course centers, their Arthurians, goes to the above system location to its firmament. That rotates the cycles in 1 center operation screen lines at 3 centers of travel. That sets blue plasma, line direct signals, and 3 grounds of surface and travel. Okay, setting signals into calculation lines. 3 lines of flux over lines of measure, scales communication system, and setting communication lines of travel. Okay? Then we outline that setting, process the indication system outside locations. Cloak and dagger. Sets communication system and all tractions, all 3 angles, and set travel. Okay, illuminate the graphs, waving screen, line signals, rotation at its surface, location setting, change all temperature relocations to its fridge, and that corresponds to its grounds, 150,000 line measure and scale, grounds of surface set position all levels, and calculation setting to travel. Then we go through platforms of setting and process of indications of 45 angles and communication. Directing ground centered structure lines, online centers, line communication system of the measure and scale of communication. Process the indication lines, online settings, and location system, all through setting and operation line sequence inside travel and set track communications. And then we set up this lines of grid line, lock line screen location system, all through calculations. Okay, there's the building. Boom, done. Now it's set up in line connection setting. All right, so now we surface the rotation system into all core centers in the communication system and flux. 3 centers of calculation setting, 3 lines of travel, 3 lines of measure and scale. Process the indication high centers, operation line sequence locations. Okay, and then we set a spin cycle into Colossus of galaxy of alignment that rotates the system as string lines in rotation system interactions, directing ground centers of tubing, 2 centers of travel, 3 lines of measure, 6 lines of scale of highways, 3 platforms in set position. So we cloak and dagger to 3 centers of 4, set lines of 5 over 6, and platforms over 8 in travel communications, directing ground centers of surface rotation setting and set calculation setting of streams. Setting calculation online signals in location system all through tractions. Directing signal location system all through measure, all through scale, all through simulation grounds, and set traction. Very powerful stuff, okay? See the pyramids and screen lines of 7 open windows? All right? Very powerful, guys, from the ground lines. All right, so we change formations of flux. The open windows come in sequence lines of grounds as sequence location system and calculations. Ground center lines of 1, traveling through set lines of 3 rotations and 4 settings of travel and track communications, inside, outside line, setting line communications, setting travel lines and direct lines of link and process communication system of the calculation. Okay? Working with string theory and highways and travel. Okay, very complicated stuff, but okay, as a catch on in sequence. All right, so the process indication lines, open lines of the windows and rotation surface and travel. Okay, then we go to the ground line sequence. We process the indication setting into the grounds of surface. All right, so we're there. There's the grounds, 150,000 grounds. Now we indicate the ground center's line sequence. We cross the line signals at 1 center and 1 track location. All right. Then we set routers and routers, 3 centers, 4 signals, 6 lines of 7, 7 lines of 8, 8 lines of 12, and 12 lines of 24, and set travel communications. Pyramid indicates the lines inside, outside rotation, surface interactions. Directing links, line panels, process indicates the setting, all through flux, all through travel, all through communications, all through angles and point communication. All right? Face recognition. All right, so face recognition comes in flats, communication of transformers and set tractions, directing ground centers, high lines of sequence, platforms over A factors, factors over C factors, over lines of E factors over screen, adaptation lines of screen locations, sets calculation grounds and high lines of sequence as simulation flux, process line centers in location system to XE thousands in platform, directing ground centers online sequence, correlation lines of traction set location system all through setting. Sets calculation grounds in sequence and location system all through travel. Directing ground centers, simulation offline center inside rotation. It's really amazing when you see the highways in set position, it's open windows, right? All we're doing is setting up the ground lines. Okay, so we go through the platforms over lines, process over 1, process over 2, process over 3, and 4 set travel. That crosses the angles and line can set in high centers in location system all through tractions. Waving screens, electrical line grids, electrical line panels, in rotation system, all through setting, all through operation system to energetic dome and screen adaptation. Inside traction, all right? Crossing 3 centers of 4 lines of flux and travel, inside line connects the system, all through structure, all through design line. Now, what we have to understand is how to correlate the time frame. Waving screens, adaptation of settings all through travel, simulation cores, and communication setting. Okay? And then we outline the signals, and we process the indication system. The torcal fields comes in highline drive. 3 centers, operation line centers of communication inside tractions. Directing lines of 4 lines of flux in circulation rotation. Setting travel ground centers in position location of system through atom rotations to propeller. Process indicates setting over cross line and orbiting of surveys and rotation surface interactions. Bringing outline signals and core centers of center operation. Okay? Very powerful stuff in set locations. All through structure, all through design. Okay? Alright. Now we center off the center and their communications in set rotation surface interactions. Right? Directing lines of triangulation over lines, 3 centers, and 3 communication system all through triangulation. Process indication lines, XT1000 comes in, platforms over line, invisible chart ways, process line, core centers, line communications. Directing ground centers, high lines of sequence in location system, all through measure, all through scale, all through setting, all through operation. Look at this. Done by equation. Okay, it's all done. Now we ground the centers and rotates inside the simulation grounds. High-line sig locates the system and set calculations. Set in the coolants and rotation lines and block frames in location setting. Here's the rubies and travel. There's the rubies, all right? Okay, setting calculation setting, all process lines. There's your sapphires. Okay. There's your emeralds. Set lines and rotation surface and travel. Line signals, set positions. There's your diamonds. All right. So as we in line centers in rotation inside rotation setting attractions, directing line simulation core sets communication to ground centers of surface and rotation lines of set position to its operation lines of sequence. Process that line signals, process the indication system of travel, inline, outline sequence locations, right? Outline, inline rotation surface and traffications. Offline signals, inside rotation of surface and travel. Okay? Okay, so it's amazing when you get position lines of travel. Know exactly what's going on in set positions. All through communication system, all through service and rotation lines that puts graphs of communication setting and travel. Okay? All right. Working over cross line and signals and simulation lines. Okay, string theory. Line signals indicate lines of flux over lines over translucent and three centers of travel. Three centers of travel. Okay, there's the platform. And then we outline signals, graph its communication settings, holographic structure of design line, and set positions. All through setting, all through operation. Okay. Crossing grid lines and simulation graphs. Okay. Core centers of travel and direct lines of length of pathogens and rotation surface of traction. Okay, indicate grounds, high signals, location system, all through setting. All right, so we go through box frames, process lines. Again, we process all core centers in position of box communication system, triangulation of flux over screen. There's the cube, right? Process calculation lines, outside the signal, tesseract comes in, and set communication. All through window, all through box frame. Okay? Platforms over E factors over three centers of travel, four settings of signals. Center op, of course, centers of portal communication setting to travel communication setting to travel. Inside, outside line communication system, all through configured system, all through calculations. Okay? Inside line centers, in that position of simulation, grounds its settings in core centers line communication of travel. Directing online settings, process lines indicates the setting of roll sequence location at translucent. Inside rotation one cycle. Process the inside rotation lines all cycle. Inside position location of travels in travel communications, all through setting, all through operation. All right. Directing ground centers, high line sequence location system and pattern. Process that indicates attractions. All right. Light over light, light over dark. All right, so we have a line signal location setting over cross line condition setting online sequence. Process its position location measure and scale. Set position of 1. Cross lines of 2 over 3 over 6. Its platforms, its communication lines of angles. And set lines of white setting. Your connection setting to overline sequence, seeing what's going on in travel, what you're doing in the set position to your system in travel. Online centers and location system and calculation. Right? Done by equation. All right? It's amazing when you come into charter waves and screen adaptations all through flux, all through setting, all through operation sequence, location system, how you set things up in location setting to the simulation. All through the grounds. All right. Now we channel off, we channel on in rotation service. We go into the underground sequence location of simulation ground communications. Sending offline centers in rotation inside travel, where you guys mechanism like condition setting in your temperature readings. Directing ground centers service, we outline the signals of triangulation that processes all calculation lines of thermometer, directing lines of 98,000 lines of scale. Process indication lines over cross line condition setting that indicates system over lines of blue lines of scale. Overline sequence, overline panel, overline set tractions and locations. Directing ground center line sequence puts all communication system and travel in that line centers in location system to set position lines of balance and set rotation. Okay? All right. So we worked with that signal. And then we go in position of home line and direct lines of grounds. Okay, so we set up the building line, structure line, division locations over cross line blue, process lines of 3 platforms, and direct lines of sync and location. Process and indication lines of grounds are 45 angles, and the rotation setting of platforms over setting. Sets calculation lines, sets communicates inside rotations. Setting travels interrelation lines of flux in the same direction and same rotation setting of platform communications. From that to that, okay? Set calculation lines at grounds, sets communication system, all 3 directions. From this, it's that position of this, it's that position of this, and travel. 3 signal lines at grounds and 45 communication lines of angles at line center linking across the 9 line center location system, all 3 directions. Directing line signals and location system, all 3 platform. Sets course centers of travel, stimulation grounds, and high line sequence location system, overlooking everything in travel. Okay, inside traction. Very powerful stuff, guys. Okay, through home and start travel. Right? Online centers and platforms and set course centers of communication. Okay. Electrical lines of fencing, electrical lines of walls. Now we plasma over line sequence, platforms over setting, over cross location system, all through calculation. Okay. Then we allocate timeline centers in rotation service that puts all communication system equivalence channels to its operation grounds and set lines of position. As the eagle line course centers comes into travels and direct lines and lines and location system and calculation. Okay? That by equation. All right. Process and indication setting, what we've done through travels, is knowing how to go through the line centers, location system, all through tractions. Okay? All right, so the next level rotates line centers and rotation lines. We hit in cloak and dagger. We set up a new mapping sequence because we don't want it to override the centers and communication setting of travel. Okay? Crossing grid line screens, online signals, offline communication and audio. Directing ground centers, crossing angles and 40 communication system and travel communications. Directing ground centers line sequence, inside rotation surface and traction. Okay? Now we work with the perimeters inside lines. So that's blue over cross line. Outside signal location system that processes its metric meters and scales and 3 centers of travel. 4 centers of measure, 5 lines and settings, rotation surface, and triangulation. Okay? So that's calculation grounds and high lines of sequence and simulation grounds and communications. Online centers and rotation surface and a 45 flux lines of angle. Simulation. Process lines and setting tractions, directing ground centers and your satellites. Satellites of 1, satellites of 2, satellites of 3, 4, and 6 location setting of travel. Directing ground centers, high line sequence, process lines of 0, 0 line setting, 3 centers of travel communications. Directing sonar, echo, process lines of 1, process lines of 2, 3, and 6, and 8, and 12 in set travel. And that rotates its setting location system. Body framing, line centers and frame communication lines and direct lines and ground communication of crop circles and travel communications. Setting offline centers, inside rotations, directing ground centers and surface, and rotation grounds and calculation. Okay? All through setting, all through operation. All right? All right, so everybody having fun? Okay, so we changed the grid line screens into black over screen and rotation surface of travel. And then we offline the signal location setting to the interconnection system all through setting. Process angles, process line signals, location setting, and graph communications. And set positions. Okay? Okay, we bring it in and set locations, triangulation, set travel. Online sequence, location setting, and set traction. Okay? Okay, so we wrote the spin cycles, process and indication lines into white, pathogens and rotation surface of mapping, over cross line inside rotation. Okay? We go inside line, inside travel communications. Okay, so you go into the monitoring system, inside lines communications. Okay? Inside traction. Right? Okay. Then we go over line center line condition set it over line sequence into orange over cross line direct signals of grounds communication and setting. Processing indication line condition system puts all communication lines at gold framing inside outside rotation setting and travel. Sets calculation ground setting and sequence. Process indicates the setting, all through flux, all through arrows of dynamics and location. All right, so we indicate the grounds. We hide travels a set position to all measure and scale, time, measure, and set location system, all through set position to its operation. All right. Directing ground centers, online sequence, location of its panel, and screen location. Okay, that's my equation. Everything I'm showing is already done. You just have to identify how this all works now in set calculation into the end of grounds. And all sequence, all panel, all through operation setting. Okay? All right. Now we work with the simulation grounds and set travel communications. Okay? Working with the line signals. Now we allocate timeline centers and sequence. Now we set course centers. Then we go with the alphabetical lines of A. Now the process of A overcrosses over B. BC equals set lines of D. Process lines of DX over frame. E factors over screen. Adaptations of flux. Set course centers. Interdimensional line rotation of sail and travel communications. Done by equation. That's set up. Now we go in line centers and building frame. 3 centers of travel and ground centers of service. Split lines of 1 in process of 2, 3 set lines of platforms. Process indicates lines of set position location to its system, all through setting. Perimeters of parameters, location setting in proxy. Course centers, line calculations, the windows. Frame communicates lines of 45 angles of time frame locations. Directing lines, split lines anomaly, 3 center and perimeters in 3 lines, 3 atmosphere screen adaptations, 6 over scale, 9s over tractions, and clocking center rotation setting and rotation surface and travel. Sets calculation ground centers inside rotation to its highways and communications. Okay, inside line connections and a 45 communication of angles and travel. Okay, online sequence, the box frame of the ground line surface is now window frame 17 receptor. Window frame. Whoa! Okay, so now we go through electrical line course centers, the calculation lines position of its motherboard, central board, central board, central board, 3 central boards, and set lines of sequence, location setting calculations. Directing lines and set position operation lines, waving screens to 3 centers and 4 lines of travel. Directing ground centers line connection system into its simulation connection system of the calculation. Process line indicate lines, process line position location all levels, process in that position locations in red. Outside, inside rotation setting and travel. Direct inside line, outline line, rotation line connection set of A factors over EE factors over C over travel. Directing ground centers line connection setting in position of cloak and dagger, inside rotation surface and communication lines of travel. Now it's all set up. Booyah. Now we go through scenario graph interference, set positions of black, into black, and 3 centers of travel. We set up the CCTV, outside course, in frame energy grids and power grids and set calculations. Directing ground centers and 3 lines of communications lines. The antenna, processing grounds, a surface location system, and all through tractions. Okay, it's all set up. Now we go through panels of screen lines of 4 lines of signals, the process and line centers, the 3 lines of communication setting of 4 lines of travel. Okay. Then we go in that position location to its system, all through electrical grid lines and communications, inside traction. All right, so coming into the computer line that rotates the cycles, setting course centers, directing links, process indicates setting, grid conversion locations, center calculation lines, iCloud, center clouds, eCloud rotation. Process indication lines of flux, 2 centers of travel, 3 centers of measure, and scale communication setting. Convergence lines, cerebral cortex, mystical cortex, matrix cortex, indirect lines and communication system, all through cerebral, indirect lines of ground communications. All right, setting signals in ground centers of all line positions, all through travel. Set communication setting of server location system calculations. Set offline signals into orange lines of sequence, creative cycles, directing ground centers and sequence location system calculations. Then we get in position lines of positional levels, process the indication setting calculations. Ground line sequence over 1, process over 2, 3, transistors, resistors, over cross screen line adaptations of flux. Indicate online centers and rotation surface into TV reception travel. Done. Now we go through grid locks. Panels over 1, 2, 3, 6, 8, 12, 14, 18, and 24 lines of sequence. Waving screens, process indicates setting of 4 line calculations. Now we're done. Online sequence, online charge, indirect lines of windows and frame communications. All right, guys, it's all done. There it is in scale. It's all set up. Boom. All through the earth line. The earth line is set up in the green line sequence. Now that channel's off. We go with the inside line, rotation, surface, and travel. Outside signal in location. And then we go in position line to ground centers, inside rotations, and security lines of panels that process in position, location, and center. Then we go into the blue line center that protects everything outside rotation to its ether core of its firmament in rotation. Okay? Okay, and then we go flux screens, setting line communications, thermometer, barometer, some location and travel, direct and ground centers, high lines and panels, a process of indication setting. 4 angles and travel and the communication of gridding. Cross angles, structure lines, mapping system, mapping pi, into travel communication setting to its open window and triangulation. Okay? Snorri graph. Translucent over screen location. Okay? All right, so that changed the I division lines and rotation lines of triangulations, flux over setting, rotation. Process indicates the setting off the calculation setting, triangulation line condition system. Sets calculation of grounds, high line sequence, and then we get in chart of waves. Process indication of floor mats and travel communications in direction. Okay? Setting the observation lines, process indications here over track locations, inside tractions. Okay? Open signals and location setting and structure. Set communication lines over 1, process over here, and set travel communications in direction, right? Online signals, location grid, and set traction. Okay? Signal line in center, offline center, in rotation, surface, and travel. Okay? Crossing angles over flux over line, and question marks in screen location system, all through tractions. Okay? Calculate and modify, switch lines anomaly, point lines of graph, into underscore, into the question underground screen locations. So no more equal sign is now in position. Now it's just set lines of platforms. Okay, to the grounds of surface and location system to its pyramid and traction. Process of here, here, and here, 4 lines of flux over screen. Done by equation. That's it. Now it's all set up through platform. All right, instead travels. And we go to 3 grounds of service into underground surface locations setting calculations. All right, the building. Structure outline settings, process indicates in system all through travel. Out center in rotation surface and box frame. Process indicates in system inside line conditions. Platforms in and 3 center line conditions. Indicate grounds, sets of 3, and set lines of setting in rotation surface and traction locations. Snorri graph interference of a structure building. So we change the angles, point communications setting, and configuration of the grounds, change the CCTV in locations to HD to HDMI. Process indication lines of grounds, calculate and modify. Center operation line sequence and center lines in rotation to 3 centers in set travel communications. Okay? It's all set up in set position. All right? Of your earth and tractions, undergrounds. Okay? Very powerful stuff, isn't it? What's going on? All right, that's done. So I'm just showing you what's already done in sequence. Okay, through pen operation screens, in location setting the platforms. Okay, in window frames, in location system interactions, and platforms of gridding and set travel communications. Okay, all through setting, all through operation. Okay, inside travel, inside connections. Okay. Everyone's going, whoa, what's going on here in set position? Okay. And set positions. All right, so take out equations. Put everybody back in platform or in 39 lines. Wait till they get to 49 sequence. Take the temperature readings back to 98%. Process mitigates the setting to time reactor. Boom. Tesseract. Travels in position lines of travel communications. Inside connections of files and rotation lines of platform communications. Okay. Indicate lines, flux over lines, 3 centers, and rotation surface and travel. Okay. The more you understand the simulation, the more you understand what's going on. So road graphs, holograph screens are location setting and travel. Direct lines of 4 lines of flux and set travel communications. Okay, all through your connection setting. All right, that's it through equations. It's amazing what we set up through structure design line. Okay. Pretty powerful stuff when you really know what's going on and you set position location of platforms. I set everything up in grid lines to the underground sequence in location setting to the Erythians, the Arterians, and the Growthians attractions. Okay? That's it. Adios.